Congratulations, you've made it to the end of our lesson. Just have a few kind of final comments to help put some of this stuff into perspective. First of all, it's very, very important that as you look at this, you remember a couple of things. First of all, that political biology is a very young field, and mistakes are going to be made. We're going to have false starts and things like that. This does not invalidate the entire field. It just means that we've got a lot more work to do. The second thing is it's emotionally difficult to think that your fate is in your genes rather than in your choices. And that's very kind of emotionally disconcerting. It calls into question what it means to be human. These are absolutely okay for you to have these kind of big questions. It's also okay for you to be uncomfortable with this material and just sit. But I urge you to sit with that discomfort and kind of understand or at least wrestle with the idea that things you think you know, maybe you didn't. We are not the only discipline to be struggling with these issues. Biology has shown under experimental conditions that when you start moving your hand, that you start moving your hand before you've actually made the conscious decision to do so. Now, this research is somewhat limited because it has to do with immediate actions and not long-term actions, and most free will kinds of questions are long-term. They're not, they're not that controlled experimental condition where all you have to do is move your hand. However, this has raised a whole bunch of questions that the philosophy department is wrestling with about the nature of free will. If free will doesn't exist, or if it is limited by various biological factors, how much of our life do we choose? And with this, of course, has policy implications. People responsible for their behavior. Is criminality coded into your genes and you have no choice except to rob that store? I mean, I don't actually believe that. Um, but but it has like paradigm shattering conclusions if you take it to its most extreme conclusion. Um, and there was a recent article by a neuroscientist, I think it was in the Atlantic, about, and in it he said, he came to the conclusion that free will probably doesn't exist, but it's in your interest to behave as if it does. Now, of course, the paradox here is how can you choose to behave a certain way if free will doesn't exist at all? And so there are huge, huge questions about all of this. Totally get if you're comfortable with it. In conclusion, political biology is young, it makes mistakes, but this means that there's a whole wide field out there, a whole wide field of new things we can do. And these new frontiers are particularly in two areas. One is in behavior, do you vote? Do you vote in every election or just primaries, those kind of things? And in ideology. This is where you are on the liberal conservative scale. Um, and this is kind of important because we're in some ways reaching the limits of what new advances we can make given the current or the traditional um, tools. For instance, in behavior, how much more is there to say about young voters versus old voters? Young voters vote. Young voters don't vote. Old voters do. And any candidate who relies on young voters actually turning out is probably running a fool's errand. But we've said that for 20, 30, 40 years. This is nothing new. We can apply it to the Bernie Biden race or whatever, but we're not really discovering anything new. In terms of ideology, how much more is there to say about women voters versus men voters? Women tend to be more concerned with social service issues like education and the environment, whereas men tend to be more concerned about the economy. We've shown this over and over and over again. It doesn't change no matter how much the times change. And so, to the extent that we've reached at least the maximum, the peak of what we can mine from these kinds of tools, and everything else is incremental, or in response to micro responses to changing circumstances. Political biology opens up an entire new world of us for us to mine. If I haven't convinced you that your life and your politics are controlled by your DNA, what I hope is that you'll keep an open mind as the field develops, as new research comes out, and you'll have a way to understand and evaluate this new research that comes out saying basically they found the liberal gene. One thing I do want to caution you is when you see studies like that, and we're seeing increasing numbers of studies about genes and behavior, all kinds of behavior, not just political behavior, keep in mind that the journalists aren't always the best at reporting on scientific journal articles. They tend to be very shallow readers of very complicated topics. And so when you see these things like they've identified the liberal gene, or they know why you vote and it has to do with your pinky, or something like that, do keep in mind that there is a limitation to how journalists report on scientific studies. Finally, I want you to know that I do not want you to walk away from this thinking that um, I think that biology is determinative. I think it's influential. I don't think it's determinative, but I think it's an interesting area to pursue. And that's why I spend a whole class discussing it. So I look forward to your comments, and I will see you next week.